Welcome to the HR on the Offensive podcast, brought to you by LACEr Partners. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to the latest HR on the Offensive podcast. It's me, Chris Howard, joining you for our weekly instalment. Today is an in-person podcast. I have two talent specialists with me. One of them works at LACEr Pavan. How you doing, man?
I'm very well, thank you.
And one of them is Jig Ramji. Jig, how you doing?
Right, very well, thank you.
You are a podcast regular on HR on the Offensive podcast. I feel like we've done 3 or 4 of these today. We've got Jig in because we want to talk about skills-based strategy. Well, we're probably going to talk about a few areas because that feels quite wide, very broad. So he's going to have a chat about a variety of elements. Pav, you've got some questions about things like reward. We want to talk about your journey as well, Jig, because obviously we're running this campaign at the moment called Becoming Skills Powered. It's all around skills-based organizations and how some organizations transition into this kind of shift towards a more skills-focused side. And we want to explore that and go through some of your background as well, if that's all right.
Sounds great.
So we have to go on with the fundamentally different question first. If you're listening to this podcast for the first time, if you haven't heard Jig or myself or Pav's dulcet tones, concept is that we are going to check in with a completely random and non-HR related question. And my question I'm going to hit with my guest co-host Pav and then our guest Jig today is that I've just read an article about a banana duct taped to a wall that sold for $6.2 million at auction. So my question, and we'll get Pav to go first, given that you're the co-host, and then we'll give Jig a minute or two to compose his thoughts. If you could sell for $6.2 million a completely random piece of modern art, what are you doing? You're not allowed to duct tape a banana to a wall.
No, although I do think duct taping banana is a great idea, especially because all of my bananas go off at some point. An easy question for me because I've just moved house. I have a zillion boxes everywhere, most of them already unpacked, but I can't actually force into the bin. So if I could make some money from that, that would be great. So I would sellotape, duct tape, cardboard boxes to anything and sell them.
Boxes, love it. I can never get enough boxes in my house because we always have too many as well because of the wife's Amazon orders. But there we go. Jig, what you got?
That is an icebreaker question, for sure. Didn't expect that one, to be honest. So I think you want to be in a world where everyth's a little bit sustainable. I like the cardboard box piece. Chris, you can call yours the Amazon, you can call yours moving. As long as you've got a good title, I think you're good. But the most important thing for me is always just really celebrating what my children do. Let's be honest, children do a lot of arts and crafts. Perhaps this is in the family because my parents are great hoarders of everything, but my kids are also great hoarders of their arts and crafts. If you could create a composite of all of the things that they've done, I'd love to create the Harry and I'd love to create the Leela. There'd be 2 distinct pieces of art that we would sell for anything up to 10 million. And then this is a podcast in itself, really, isn't it?
Well, let's get into the details. Let's talk about the skills strategy, the skills-based organizations. We can touch on bits of the campaign if we want to. If you can give our listeners a little bit of your background and businesses you've worked in.
Yeah, so in the spirit of skills, I think let's kind of almost talk about it in a slightly different way. I think we talk about organizations and we talk about roles, but I'm going to kind of almost talk a little bit differently. Back in the day when I was still young and impressionable and aspirational, psychologist by background, so it probably makes sense to be a talent professional to some extent, but hadn't actually worked in talent for quite a long time. Started off recruiting in executive search for central government and regional government in the north of England, and did a bit of work for an organisation called Fujitsu, but did lots of different roles, building skills in marketing and comms, project management, sales, group reward, and other roles related to people. Then built on that and built skills and capability around consulting, predominantly at Deloitte, where I met many of LACE guys that I know. And that was great because actually working in a professional services environment does actually focus on your skills and your experiences. And so that for me was a real first sense of how powerful it can be, because that is fundamentally what you're selling. You're selling skills and capabilities. Had the great privilege of then moving from the UK out to Australia, still in that consulting environment. Then did that internally as well. So kind of did that consulting, but within an investment bank called Macquarie. That thing where, do I carry on down the consulting route or do I go back in-house? And at that time moved over to Singapore and then went back into more traditional HR roles and very much in that generalist space. Head of HR for APAC, for Bloomberg, and then did several other roles for them as well, Global Chief People Officer, and then moved into talent for the first time. Ever since then, I've worked in that talent environment, Chief Talent Officer, Head of Talent, Culture, Leadership, Learning, D&I, all of those things that you associate with talent.
So that brings me to my first question. When we think about skills-based organizations, everybody's brain naturally goes to talent, leadership, talent acquisition, and how you can infuse your organization with the right skills at the right time. I wanted to ask a slightly controversial question about the reward function. There are smatterings of conversation with reward professionals and HR professionals around skills-based reward. What's your perspective on that? Have you seen any success stories? Where are they in that continuum of becoming skills-based?
Well, I think it's probably broader than just the skills agenda. But one of the things I've seen over the last, maybe 5 to 10 years is this definitive need for organizations to be agile, transformative, change-oriented, anticipating the next big shift or being the catalyst of change. And the people function's often asked to be the pioneers or certainly the catalysts of that. The structure of work, the structure of an organization has remained quite traditional in most cases. Yeah. And there are examples of organizations that are more agile and thoughtful around this and perhaps slightly smaller in scale. But the vast majority of larger organizations have struggled to move out of that traditional structure. I think reward has got stuck in there as well, because reward often is the guardian of that traditional structure.
Yeah.
And that's been posed as challenges from other consultancies to say, how do we look at this in a much more holistic way for skills-based organizations to truly emerge? You can't just look at a part of the organization, let's call it talent or learning or recruitment or hiring, to look at skills, but actually, how do you look at it holistically across the organization and grapple with some of that tradition and structure and give it some impetus to change? And I think we haven't done that well enough so far. Now, of course, that could certainly change, but that's certainly my experience.
And I echo everything that you said. If you look at how job architecture and leveling and conversations around competencies linked to rewards, they are so embedded in how we think about our work identity that taking a different approach and not coupling titles and rewards and levels just feels so alien to organizations. They don't always know where to start. Have you seen any good practices or, fresh shoots growing in the reward conversation?
I certainly haven't seen it in the nation. What I've seen is certainly organizations that are looking very much at almost fractional careers. So kind of almost thinking, actually, how do we utilize Chris's skills across a multitude of roles? And I've certainly seen organizations talk a lot about skills convergence and skills adjacencies.
Yes.
I think that's the green shoots that are starting to emerge. There is an element of bravery required or courage, perhaps, for organizations to go down that route. And one of the things I think, Pav, you and I have actually spoken about this before, is how do you actually look within an organization and find parts where you can start to experiment? So for me, one of those examples could be something like early careers. You've got a mindset and a generation who actually would revel in that type of environment. Why not start to incubate ideas as an experiment within an organization and say, actually, let's break structure across the organization. Let's try this in parts and see how it goes.
Is that how you build out almost your business case at LACEr? We obviously talk about that value case as well. Have you recently done some workshops around building out your skills value case? So somebody listening into this podcast who's thinking, okay, this is interesting. I've been banging on the door of my CPO to try and pivot away from these traditional norms. Somebody listening in from that perspective, advice from your point of view, where they're only just starting, and how do I actually build my value case around this? How do I convince the organization? Part of it you kind of hinted at, which is give it a trial, do a pilot, like look at one particular area. But is there any other bits of advice you'd give around things that you need to do to try and drive that value case?
So experimentation, I'm a big fan of, right? If you're launching products, experimenting and giving it a go is now almost the norm. So actually, why can't you do that with things like skill strategy? The other piece, I think, is we know that there is a real dependency for certain future skills within organizations. And some of that is agnostic of sector, but actually in some cases, there is real need to think about sector-specific skills that we're going to require in the future. There is no way that you can hire some of those skills for every single role that you need going forward. So there has to be an element of broader strategy around how you either reskill or build capability. If we look at the energy sector as a good example, there are multiple roles that are going to be required that don't exist today. But I think that's a powerful business or a burning platform that gives an organization the opportunity to look at things in a slightly different way. No, perhaps that's still experimentation, albeit in a slightly different way.
Organizations do this without really acknowledging that, and they do it in the most undemocratic way. There are people in organizations that go from project to project, to strategic initiative to strategic initiative. They make careers out of it, and they're typically in the leadership teams, either of the functional area or of the business. Those people have been handpicked, whether they were grads or they've just done a great job with a group of people, and they have the license to experiment and build new skills on these projects. It exists within an organization. However, it's not open to everybody. And what we're saying here is, grads, you've got a great cohort here. What are the other parts of your workforce where you're willing to take this courageous step? It definitely exists in most organizations. I think both of us worked in local government, public sector. It definitely happens with cohorts of people. It's just not acknowledged, and it's not fair.
It's certainly accidental in some cases. I think the other piece for me is we talk about the responsibility of organizations to do some of this. There is also a responsibility on individuals as well to make courageous decisions. I think we all individually get drawn into the traditional work structure. And, a multitude of career development conversations with some people, and people have asked and said, well, I want to be at that level. And my question has been, doing what? And they're like, I don't know, I'm just really keen to be from level 6 to level 7, but not actually focusing on the skills, the experiences, the role, all of the things that we all know deep down matter more than being at level 6 or 7. And I think there is an element and a culture that an organization can set around developing your career, not in a linear fashion, but developing your career based on skills, capabilities, experiences, etc.
Do you think the culture question will therefore hamper organizations taking the plunge into that skills-based approach? Because there are some organizations that are very traditional. There's some industries that just, are they ever going to be geared up for this unless it becomes an actual business driver imperative that they have to do it?
I think language is important. I've worked at many organizations where linear progression was the language that people used. I've also worked in organizations where they talk about progressing your career. It's very nuanced, but actually promotion versus career progression. If everyone describes things as career progression or career development, you're almost taking this linear equation out and focusing on breadth, depth, etc. I think if organizations can set the culture around that concept, it's easier for individuals to then adopt that mindset philosophy and actually take risks.
And that comes back to rewards. So that ladder, the non-kind of jungle gym, it's the ladder versus the jungle gym. I want to be a level 7 because that comes with certain rewards, a certain level, a certain title. We need to take that plunge into what our levels need to look like so that we can embrace people doing different things and acknowledge the skills they're building, whether that's, it could be a one-off payment, it could be a secondment at a different level. Where are we willing? And this is where actually in public sector, they do this quite often, but have we seen this in the private sector enough? Doing that secondment at a different level so that you can gain those experiences. Do you think we, in this culture bucket, there's language, but there's also the incentives that haven't quite caught up?
Yeah, and I must say that there's definitely been certainly at least one example of an organisation that did this quite well. Now, that didn't mean just because you took on a different role, so maybe a curveball role, that you would get a reward for it. But there was always the opportunity to evaluate whether the individual merited a reward. So today I'm a supply chain professional and tomorrow I work in HR. Let's have a review of that as whether that merits a career progression reward. And I think without dwelling on it too much, it had created a culture of people wanting to try different things and experiences. The other piece I do think, and we talked about this almost 10 years ago, if we utilize better data points to evaluate people's, I'm going to call it skills, but it could be any type of language is probably merited. If we use better data points, that could be experiences, breadth of roles, it could be deep technical skills, could be behavioral skills, utilizing that in a much more holistic way would also perhaps help promote movement and trying different experiences. Because what you're then saying is, I'm going to choose PAV because PAV has a range of data points that shows breadth and depth of skills, experiences, capabilities versus an individual that has a very linear set of skills and capabilities and experiences.
To what extent do you think technology then plays a role in this? We want to set up this program, this process whereby we can start to codify all of those skills so that we can then start moving people around for internal mobility. But we had a chat about this before we were actually doing the podcast. What's your experience in the tech that's out there? How ready is it to get people to this utopia?
So I think the abundance of technology now and the use of word abundance is deliberate, means that there is awesome tech solutions available to most organizations now to augment the data set they have. However, it cannot negate the fact that you've got to truly, with rigor and precision, understand the data sets that you want to collect. And having that discipline, rigor around you almost thinking of skills as a data set is probably the most important part of the equation. You do that really well. There are so many technology solutions, whether that's in the face of talent marketplace, augmentation of skills data, things like TechWolf. There is so much out there that organizations can use, but it's not a magic solution whereby you press a button and all of a sudden you get world-class skills data. You still have to do the work around curating what data sets you really want and having that discipline for the long term.
Yeah, and we hear about this all the time, the mess of data. What have you got to tell our listeners about the endless debate that I have, skills versus competency versus behaviour? Is there an easy way to unpick the complexity that exists?
It's interesting. One of the things that I underappreciated in most of the recent organisations that I've worked in is, in my mind, I thought this was very clear. And then the number of times you then have those conversations and you engage with leaders. In fact, when you engage with HR folks as well, it wasn't very clear in people's mind around language. And so for me, it was one of those moments of great learning to say, if you don't articulate as part of your skills philosophy or vision what all of those terminologies mean and your preferred terminology, you're making a big mistake. And then all of a sudden, you're getting organizations using terms interchangeably. Yeah. For me, it's a nomenclature piece and agreeing at an organization level what language you're going to use, why, and what it actually means. It's almost a bit of a definition game. We went with skills for most organizations that we've gone with, and then divided those into technical and non-technical. I use the word non-technical deliberately again, rather than behavioural, because I don't like behavioural too much. But that's how we did it. And then we articulated that philosophy around skills, what our vision was, and that it was a clear data set that we'd use across the employee life cycle. And it was one of those moments where everyone went, that's so useful. And you kind of think, that was in my head. I just not put it on paper. But I think you have to put it on paper.
We have this conversation time and time again because people get confused, especially in big, global, diverse organizations, many that you've worked in as well, inherent so much complexity around heavily regulated roles that require certifications and qualifications every single year. There is a need to keep the competency definitions and language there, but do you need to migrate those same technical skills or even behavioural skills that exist within that particular profession elsewhere? No, is our answer. Simplify, because that gives you the license to see the similarities and differences across your organisation rather than get bogged down in the detail. I really liked what you said around getting that language right and socialising those definitions.
All those years of working in different organisations, working consulting, you forget sometimes that the most powerful things are related to simplicity with talent strategy. It was so important to me the first time it happened, where somebody said, I don't really understand this talent strategy. And the reason they didn't understand the talent strategy wasn't because it was overly complicated. It's just that we didn't have an articulated philosophy. But what is our talent purpose at this organization? Once we identified that, the strategy made sense. It's very easy for people in the HR function or talent function to have all of this stuff circling in their head, but without helping the organization and leaders understand the basics and the simplicity of your philosophy, it means nothing.
One of my questions I wanted to ask you is, we've talked a lot around businesses pivoting, turning into this skills mindset approach as opposed to traditional medium. The HR professionals listening into this thinking, I'm quite interested in investing in this. What's kind of HR's role? You've touched on the communication piece around articulating vision and stuff, but is there any other bits that you can call out, which is if there's a HR professional listening in now, if they're saying, well, what's my involvement in all of this? What kind of advice can you give?
The best way I would describe it is describe the outcome that you're trying to create for the organization, because everyone relates to outcomes. That doesn't mean that your skills or talent strategy or broader people strategy needs to be any less complicated. But if you can get people behind the outcome that you're trying to create as a result of your approach for skills, there is a very good chance you'll win people over at the most important part of your journey. Because once they understand that, and once they understand that this is the outcome that they will then receive as a business leader or an organization, what you then end up doing in terms of the complexity of your strategy is kind of on you. That's where your subject matter expertise goes through. But I think we get very drawn into technical descriptions of skill strategy, performance strategy, or talent identification processes, guilty as most HR professionals are. But as soon as you start keeping the language centered on outcomes, you win businesses over and you get licensed to operate across anything that you do. And I think skills is just a good example of that.
This is very in line to the LACEr approach, where you can take your HR brain outside of the thing that you're doing. The number of HR professionals I speak to on a daily basis who say, my business problem is I don't have the skills data. That is not the business problem. What do you need that data for? What the outcome, as you say, Jake, that you're trying to achieve? That will either be a functional strategy or a business strategy that is going to, either make more money for the business or make sure that you've got the right sales representatives in the right place. But I do think we get hung up again on the technical, the behavioural, the language, the actual technology that we need to use rather than the thing that we're trying to drive. And I think we're all guilty of that. But I think the more that we have conversations about what does the business actually want you to do, Mr. or Mrs. HR person?
And this is where I think if you have the opportunity to work with product people, it's such an enlightening experience. It certainly happened for me that as soon as you work with product people, that product could be the best thing in the world. But unless people truly understand the outcome of that product and what it will materially give you, no one wants to buy the product. Like the iPod wasn't the first product off the ranks, but it helped people understand the outcome that it was trying to create. And all of a sudden, as soon as people understand that, the wins are there for all to see. And then all of a sudden, there's this success story for Apple based on a product that wasn't the first cab off the rank game.
So we're almost out of time. So if you've got any more questions you want to ask me, you can. I have a kind of general finisher question, which I can... Well, it's more kind of advice. So we've unpicked quite a lot here today. We've talked around the value case. You can check out the Lace Partners website. If you go to lacepartners.co.uk/skills, you can see all the details on our campaign. We've got stuff around skills strategy. We've got stuff around how do you go about building one, or how do you develop your value case. There's a whole bunch of stuff there. You talk about the need for HR and businesses to have a commonality in language. We've talked around a whole gamut of different things. Somebody's listened to this for 30 minutes. Any takeaway, if you've only been able to do one or two of these things or think through and start to articulate that externally or internally within your business, what would that be? And I might ask that to you actually, Pav, as well. So we'll start with Jig and then any final take.
I think it is really about what are the problems that you are trying to solve? If there's one thing you do really well, it's what are the problems that you're trying to solve and what are the outcomes that you're going to achieve as a result of it. If you do that, it doesn't matter whether you're talking about an HR solution, a finance solution, a marketing solution, a technology solution, it will help you to sell what you're trying to achieve. And you will have buy-in from the outset. So for me, that would be my little piece of advice.
Love it. Has he actually stolen your final comment?
I'm going to add. So I overwhelmingly agree with start with a business problem, but I do want to reassure HR professionals that not all functions in your organisation, not all of your workforce types need the same solution. So stop trying to apply things universally. It will simplify the thinking and it will simplify the value case that you're trying to make.
Absolutely love it. Jig, where can people find you on the internet? LinkedIn?
They can find me on LinkedIn. I think it's Jig Ramji 1980, I believe, is my profile name.
Cool. Pav, where can they find you?
In the LACE office, obviously, and on LinkedIn, Pavan Bilkhoo.
Hopefully you've enjoyed listening to this podcast. It's been fascinating chewing the fat with Jig again, and of course you as well, co-host Pav. Thank you very much. Hopefully you've enjoyed this podcast. If you want to check out that catalogue, it's got a couple of really interesting ones that we delve into. You can do so at lacepartners.co.uk/podcast. But for now, from myself, from Jig and Pav, thank you very much for listening. And hopefully we'll catch you next time on the HR on the Offensive Podcast. Bye.